In the early haze of spring, just as the last snow melted into the gurgling streams beneath the forest floor, a patrol from the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center ventured deep into the Appalachian woodland, following the call of an anonymous hiker who had heard what they believed to be the cry of a wounded animal. It was barely audible against the rustling leaves, but persistent like a note of sorrow played over and over again. The team moved carefully, stepping over moss-covered logs and ducking under low-hanging branches until they spotted a pair of golden eyes peering from the underbrush. The shape was small, trembling not larger than a house cat, but unmistakably wild with tufted ears and faint rosettes fading into sandy brown fur. This was a bobcat cub alone and calling out for something that was no longer there. The rescuers approached slowly, one of them crouching low, holding out a piece of cloth soaked in milk replacement formula. The cub did not run. Instead, it tilted its head and whimpered weakly before collapsing from exhaustion. It was dehydrated and underweight, barely clinging to life as they wrapped it in a flannel blanket and radioed back to the center. No sign of the mother, no blood, no tracks, just the lone cub curled beneath a thicket as though waiting for something to return. The rescue team did not speak much during the return hike. There was an unspoken weight to this kind of recovery, because in cases like these, survival was not guaranteed back. At the center, the cub was placed in a quiet recovery room separate from the others, its heartbeat fragile, its breath uneven. But by the end of the second day, it had begun to respond to formula and heating pads, blinking its golden eyes more frequently. And pawing weakly at the soft bedding the staff took shifts watching over it, one of them nicknamed it Cedar after the grove, where it was found, not knowing how important that name would become in the weeks ahead. What none of them realized was that Cedar would soon shift the dynamic of the center in a way that neither biologist nor handler had ever experienced. Just 2 enclosures down from the cub's resting pen was a gentle goat named Mabel who had been brought in 3 months earlier. After a roof collapse at a local farm, her hind leg had healed, but she was kept for observation due to her unusually calm demeanor, which seemed to have a positive effect on other recovering animals. Rabbits that had panicked in crates quieted when placed near her young deer fawns who had refused to eat, began to nibble at leaves when Mabel stood close enough for them to lean against her. It was subtle and unexplained, but the staff began calling her the Sanctuary Mother when Cedar was moved to a larger enclosure with windows into the next stall. Mabel was the first living creature he saw outside of a human. The cub watched her intently, eyes never leaving her silhouette as she munched slowly on hay. Her presence seemed to calm him in, a way the handlers couldn't replicate. Even when they sat beside his pen and offered his favorite formula-soaked blanket, he would only respond when Mabel wandered close, drawn to her, as if by instinct or some deeper thread that bypassed species. And survival cues? Initially, the staff thought it was coincidence the way he would rise and approach the mesh divider each time she passed, or how he would fall asleep only when Mabel lay down nearby. But as the days stretched into week patterns emerged, Cedar began mimicking her movements, tilting his head the way she did, or curling his body in a similar arc when resting. And once during a sudden thunderstorm when the building shook with wind, Cedar bolted toward the divider, mewling until Mabel pressed her flank against the mesh and stood there unmoving until he calmed. The debate started quietly among the staff. Should they attempt supervised interactions? Was it too risky? What if instinct overrode whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them? But every time they voiced concern, they looked over to see the cub lying quietly against the divider, while Mabel chewed thoughtfully as if knowing something. They did not. Eventually, a decision was made to allow brief, monitored encounters with barriers in place and staff on standby. And so the first official meeting began under the watchful eyes of cameras and colleagues. To everyone's astonishment, Cedar did not pounce or hiss or retreat. Instead, he crept forward. Slowly, tail-low eyes locked on Mabel, who stood still waiting. Then he stretched out a paw, touched her foreleg lightly, and let out a sound that was not quite a mewl, not quite a growl, but something in between, something closer to a question. Mabel responded by lowering her head and gently nudging him with her nose, a gesture so maternal, so deliberate, that even the most experienced handlers stood in stunned silence, unable to look away. What happened next deepened the mystery. Cedar followed, Mabel around the pen, weaving through her legs, brushing against her side, imitating the way she stepped, and even attempting to climb onto her back, a motion typical of young goats but never before seen in a bobcat cub. He made a small bleating sound, barely formed but unmistakably modeled after her vocalizations, and Mabel in return nuzzled him patiently, licking the top of his head as if grooming her own offspring. In the days that followed, the bond only grew. Cedar refused food unless Mabel was nearby. He paced if she was taken away for routine checks and resumed play only upon her return. When staff tried to place him with other cubs, he withdrew, becoming listless until reunited with the goat, whose calm presence now seemed vital to his development more than just companionship. It was as if Mabel had imprinted herself onto the wild instincts of the cub, rewriting some ancient code with gentleness and stillness. Scientists from the state university began visiting the center, drawn by the unusual interspecies behavior. They ran tests, non-invasive ones measuring cortisol levels and neural response patterns in Cedar, comparing his reactions with those of other cubs in isolation or paired with members of their own species. What they found was baffling. Cedar exhibited lower stress levels in the presence of Mabel than he did when alone, and even lower than those recorded in cubs with their own mothers back in the wild. More peculiar was the way Cedar began adopting behavioral patterns entirely foreign to his species. He no longer stalked moving objects with the same precision. Instead, he would tap them gently with his paw and glance toward Mabel, as if seeking permission or approval when given enrichment toys with feathers or fur. He would carry them to her, lay them at her hooves, and wait, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. The scientists recorded everything, but still could not explain what they were witnessing. Then one morning after a night of heavy rain, the power cut out, briefly disrupting the automated gate system that separated their pens. And when the staff arrived at dawn, they found the enclosure open, Mabel standing calmly in the center, and Cedar nestled tightly against her stomach, fast asleep. His breathing slow, his limbs relaxed, his tiny body rising and falling in perfect rhythm with hers, as if he had been there all along. No one moved for several moments, unsure of whether to intervene or let the scene unfold. And as the wind rattled, the gutters outside, a decision had to be made. Would they continue to study this impossible bond, or step back and witness what nature was doing in its own time, without interference, without boundaries? Because deep in that quiet pen, surrounded by the echoes of rain and the soft bleats of a goat, a wild bobcat cub was dreaming not of the forest he was taken from, but of a warmth that transcended species and instincts. And something far deeper was beginning to stir in the minds of those who watched it. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about survival and connection, and the mysterious, untamed paths the heart can take. At first, the incident was written off as a fluke, a brief malfunction in the power grid caused by the storm and nothing more. But the staff could not shake what they had witnessed that morning. Cedar nestled beside Mabel, not with the wary posture of a predator, but with the surrendered trust of a newborn beside its mother. And even more perplexing, Mabel had shown no signs of fear or even hesitation. She had accepted the bobcat cub into her space without so much as a warning bleater. The next week, the decision was made to allow supervised shared enclosure time between the two, beginning with 30-minute intervals, then extending to 1 hour, then 2. And with each passing day, the staff grew more convinced that they were witnessing something more than survival, something beyond comfort or coincidence. The cub no longer paced when alone, no longer lashed out during feedings. Instead, he began to exhibit a new routine, one shaped entirely around the rhythms of Mabel's day. Rising when she rose, eating only after she had begun to chew, settling into rest only when she lay beside him. The scientists returned this time with more equipment and more questions. They placed small wireless monitors in the enclosure to track stress hormones, neural activity, and social cues, comparing Cedar's behavior to a control group of wild cubs at a remote reserve. But the results were not only unusual, they were almost statistically impossible. Cedar's cortisol levels dropped sharply in Mabel's presence. His brain scans showed increased oxytocin levels, similar to what researchers saw in bonded mammal pairs, particularly those between mother and infant. What was even more bewildering was the development of mimicry. Cedar had begun to bleat a high-pitched sound that was rough at first but refined itself over time into something Startlingly close to Mabel's own vocalizations, he began to follow her during feedings, chewing slowly when she did licking at water, instead of lapping like a feline, and one day, when Mabel butted a gate. With her head, Cedar did the same, repeating the gesture with almost perfect timing and precision, as if he had studied her movement and imprinted it into his own. The staff began to notice a new behavior, one that bordered on the bizarre Cedar started. Presenting objects to Mabel as gifts, not prey, but items he had found in the enclosure. A worn cloth toy, a pine cone, a small stick all laid at her feet, with careful placement and followed by a low purring sound that none of them had heard before. From a bobcat, it was not a territorial sound. It was something softer, something meant to reassure or communicate trust. And each time Mabel would sniff the object, then nuzzle Cedar in return, reinforcing a loop that baffled even the most seasoned ethologists. There was a heated debate among the scientific observers whether this was a rare imprinting event or something entirely new, perhaps a result of early trauma and environmental adaptation. But one thing became clear. Cedar was not simply tolerating Mabel, he had formed an emotional dependency on her, one that challenged their assumptions of predator-prey dynamics and even the rigidity of species roles in early development. Then came the first behavioral test, one designed to measure instinctual responses in recovering predators. A live rabbit was placed in a separate enclosure adjacent to Cedar with a clear divider. The goal was not to cause harm, but to observe his reaction and measure his drive to hunt. It was a controlled setup used many times before with rehabilitating carnivores. Cedar approached the divider, stared at the rabbit for a long moment, and then turned away, walking back to Mabel and curling beside her without a single sign of agitation or predatory arousal. The test was repeated with different stimuli: feathers, fur, dangling toys. Nothing provoked the chase response. Instead, Cedar responded only when Mabel moved or vocalized. The data collected was shared with experts across the country, and soon, the small rehabilitation center became the focus of national attention. Researchers from larger institutions requested access. Geneticists wondered if Cedar had a mutation. Neurologists proposed early trauma may have rewired his neural pathways. But none of the theories fully explained the most compelling part of the story. Cedar was thriving. Despite rejecting the behaviors expected of his species, he was growing stronger, more coordinated, his coat thick and healthy, his weight surpassing that of other rescued cubs of his age, his heartbeat steady, his demeanor calm and alert, but always oriented toward Mabel, as if she were the axis of his universe, and in a sense she was. But nature has a way of testing what we think we understand. And one morning that test arrived in the form of a new arrival, a second bobcat cub found near a construction site, injured, dehydrated, aggressive. The new cub named Bristle was everything Cedar had once been, but without the connection that had saved him from fear and isolation. And when Bristle was placed in the enclosure beside Cedar, the contrast was immediate. Bristle hissed, growled, clawed at the divider. Cedar stared in silence, his body low, his ears back. Not in fear, but confusion. He did not respond in kind. He did not approach. And when Mabel walked by, Cedar ran to her, brushing against her legs, and looking back at Bristle with something like sorrow in his golden eyes. The staff tried controlled introductions between the two cubs, hoping perhaps Cedar's calm nature would soothe Bristle, but the opposite happened. Bristle lunged, Cedar retreated, and Mabel positioned herself between them without hesitation, her body stiff, her eyes locked on Bristle as if she understood the threat. Tests were halted. Bristle was moved to a separate facility more suitable for traditional rehabilitation, but something had shifted in Cedar after the encounter. He became quieter, more withdrawn, sleeping closer to Mabel than ever before, watching the door as if expecting another intruder, and for the first time, the staff wondered if his connection to Mabel had not only reshaped his instincts, but also dulled them, perhaps irreversibly. The dilemma was now unavoidable. Cedar was growing, and soon he would be of age to release back into the wild, a process that had always been the goal, but now seemed not only unlikely, but possibly cruel. How could he survive without the goat who had become his anchor? Would he hunt? Would he defend himself? Could he even integrate into the wild without the social conditioning of his species? The experts argued, debated, some insisting he could be slowly weaned, others warning that his development had passed a critical threshold and could not be undone. Date was set for a final assessment, a full health screening, combined with an evaluation of behavioral independence to determine whether Cedar would be prepared for a transitional habitat or whether his bond with Mabel was permanent and would require long-term sanctuary care the night before the assessment. The staff watched as Cedar climbed onto Mabel's back for the first time, resting there in silence. His paws folded under him, his eyes closed as Mabel remained still beneath his. Wait. The next morning, the gates were unlocked and Cedar was led to the open testing field, a wide grassy space bordered by forest meant to simulate his natural habitat. Mabel was kept at a distance just beyond the tree line to avoid interference. As Cedar stepped forward, ears twitching, eyes scanning, he paused only once, looking back toward the gate, and then forward again. What he would do next could not be predicted, not by science, not by instinct, not by the dozens of eyes watching from behind. Mirrored glass. Because in the space between wildness and belonging, Cedar was about to choose. And whatever that choice was, it would leave everyone holding their breath. Cedar stood at the edge of the testing field, the open land stretching before him like a silent challenge bordered by towering trees and the scent of pine and damp earth. His ears twitched as the wind shifted, carrying with it the sounds of distant birds and the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. But he did not move forward. Instead, he looked back again toward the place he had come from, toward the figure barely visible at the edge of the clearing. The familiar curve of Mabel's form, her white coat dappled with sunlight as she stood perfectly still, watching him. Observers held their breath as the moment stretched. Cedar was no longer the frail cub found trembling beneath a thicket. He was lean now, his muscles stronger, his coat full, and his gaze sharp and alert. But the question was no longer about his body. It was about his mind and his heart, and whether the instincts of his kind had taken root, or whether something entirely different had claimed him. He stepped forward slowly, his paws pressing into the soil, his movements cautious but fluid like water. Slipping around stone, he lowered his head, sniffing the grass ears, flicking at every noise. But his eyes were no longer fixed on the horizon. They kept darting back to where Mabel stood as if some invisible tether bound them across the distance. Squirrel darted across the clearing, vanishing up a tree. Cedar watched it, but made no move to pursue the staff. Took notes quickly, eyes moving between their monitors and the field, whispering possibilities, theories, predictions, the scene unfolding. Before them was unprecedented, a predator raised with no prey, a wild animal who had chosen the company of a gentle goat over the raw hunger of the hunt. Then, Cedar stopped dead in his tracks, his body tensing, his ears swiveling toward the underbrush. A low sound came from the forest ahead, not threatening but alive. Another animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, and for the first time the cub crouched low, his tail swaying slightly, his muscles tightening. It was a stance they had seen before. A moment of instinct emerging from within, a glimmer of the wild flickering beneath the surface of his domesticated calm. He moved a step closer toward the sound. The staff leaned forward. One hand hovered over the emergency recall signal just in case. And from the far edge of the clearing, Mabel let out a single soft bleat. It was quiet but clear, drifting across the space like a thread pulling at Cedar's core. And he froze, his body stiff, his ears flicking toward the sound, his tail stilling in the grass. Another bleat followed. Not urgent, not distressed, just present, just there like an anchor. And Cedar rose slowly, his head turning back, his eyes locking on Mabel's unmoving shape. And in that instant, the decision was made, not with a dramatic gesture, not with a roar or a run, but with a simple turning of paws. As Cedar stepped away from the forest and began to walk back toward her, gasps echoed softly through the control room as monitors recorded every movement, the cub moving with certainty. And calm, not confusion, not fear, but choice. A choice that defied everything written in their books, everything they thought they knew about nature and instinct, and the boundary between the wild and the tamed. Cedar reached her and curled beside her, pressing his body into her side as he had done since the first day they met. Mabel lowered her head and nuzzled him once gently, and the field fell into silence except for the breeze whispering through the grass and the soft clicking of the cameras, capturing a moment no one would be able to explain. The assessment was abandoned, the reports rewritten, the release plan postponed indefinitely, and Cedar was moved back into the sanctuary not as a temporary resident, but as a permanent one, a subject. Of study, yes, but more than that, a symbol, a question, and perhaps an answer, all wrapped into one. The sanctuary staff adjusted their routines, building a larger joint enclosure for Cedar and Mabel, one that gave them space to roam, to explore, to grow. Together, the space included trees and climbing structures for Cedar's shade and soft soil, for Mabel a hybrid habitat designed not from textbooks, but from observation and intuition, because no precedent could dictate what they were.